Tariffs are back on the table that could impact beer, wine, and spirits. And what's there to make of Chapter 11 bankruptcies from a leading vodka maker? We explore what you need to know across categories and course correct some runaway narratives while sharing unexpected storylines you should be watching at the end of this year. I'm Sightline's Director of Insights, Brian Roth, joined by lead analyst Kate Burnett for this episode of The Gist. And Kate, we're going to start with a topic that has been top of mind for many people, both in politics and just across the country: tariffs. President-elect Trump has talked a lot about what he plans to do with tariffs on foreign goods once he takes office in January 2025. Let's set the stage for how we're going to talk about it real quick. Give some context for what we mean when we're talking about what tariffs are on the table here.
Sure. So since being elected, Trump has had a lot of different messaging on tariffs. Obviously, he's planning to put significant ones in place, but there's been a lot of open questions about exactly tariffs from which countries, at what rate, etc. We've gotten a little more clarity over the last couple of weeks. So it looks like we are looking at a 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico, and perhaps 10% on those from the EU and UK. So this, I think the question we can ask here is, what does this mean for alcohol producers abroad? What does this mean for alcohol producers in the US? And what does it mean ultimately for the American consumer if these are to go into place?
Well, let's start with some of those questions. So obviously, if we're talking about these tariffs, you just saw on your screen, if you're watching with us on YouTube, the potential per share earnings losses for spirits companies internationally and what that could mean. But maybe let's start with like the way that we often like to think about these topics at Sightlines from a consumer point of view, because ultimately that obviously connects to all these other points of information and curiosity as well. What's at stake when we think about how this might impact consumers and how they think about their spending and choices?
Yeah, the first question that any consumer has about tariffs is this going to raise the cost of things I buy? And the answer here is almost certainly yes, based on the economists that I've spoken to. That is what tariffs are designed to do, is to raise prices on goods imported from various countries. So almost certainly, there are measures and levers that companies can pull to try to minimize the price increases they have to pass on to consumers, but ultimately it raises prices. And interestingly, and I think an under-discussed aspect of this, it raises prices. Tariffs tend to also raise prices on goods that are not affected or not directly taxed under this scheme. Why? Because if you are, say, a domestic beer producer and all of a sudden Mexican beers are 25% more expensive for consumers, it gives you runway to raise your prices by some amount, right? Maybe not by 25%, but by some amount, because that's the new threshold, right? Yeah. So tariffs do just tend to create inflation of prices. So consumers are almost certainly likely to see higher prices. To what degree and in which exact sectors, I think we'll still have to wait and see, and how much price other brands will take in response to tariffs is an open question. But almost certainly consumers will see higher prices on some goods. And then the question becomes, what do they do as a result of that? Do they buy less of the same brands? Do they swap brands? Do they swap categories? For example, we know that beer is less reliant on imports as an entire category than spirits or wine. Spirits and wine are heavily import weighted in the US. So, does beer suddenly become slightly more appealing? But then again, the most popular beers in America are coming from Mexico. So it's kind of an open question of how consumers will feel this and how precisely they will shift their buying habits, but almost certainly rising prices on some of the most popular brands, beer, wine, or spirits in America, are going to shake up what Americans are buying.
Yeah, I think there are two valuable ways to think about this, both in category and the potential for brands too. If you're with us on the video version of the gist, you can see a chart, a month by month follow of Mexican imports volume share of beer that is sold in the United States. So we have been continuously rising in a linear path. We're setting new records every year. So right now, depending on the month of 2024, things might be about 17 to 20% of beer distributed in the US and sold is Mexican imports. That's an all-time high. Mexican imports, Mexican beer represents about 81 to 83% of all imported beer brought into the US too. So obviously, this is a huge chunk of what's going on. And Kate, this chart, along with the way that we think about tariffs, it might spell kind of a scary situation for powerhouses like Modelo or Pacifico. I do want to call out, though, one thing, and this is certainly an aspect of the beer industry that we have been tracking for a while. The broader acceleration of bunny rabbit here, cerveza.
Mm,
How craft brewers of all stripes across the country have embraced Mexican lager in its various forms as brands to include in their portfolio. So the
mm,
natural inclination is to think then, okay, so like you're pointing out, if say Modelo is going to be more expensive in the pandemic, Constellation Brands has said they've corrected this. They did have issues with supply chain as well, both because of the pandemic and as well as impacts from tariffs too. So the question is there opportunity to be had, I suppose, just because with that price range for some of the most popular Mexican beers in the country, we have domestic producers who are producing beers of this ilk too. This potentially creates the opportunity, but again, we come back to this pricing and what people choose to do, even if it's made in the U.S. A cerveza, perhaps we're still talking about higher prices that could be a turnoff all the same.
100%. For craft producers, as well as any beer producer, they're looking at higher tariffs on aluminum from Canada, which is where the vast majority of US used aluminum comes from. Canada has been exempt previously from tariffs on aluminum. Trump has now said those would go into place. So again, perhaps prices are now higher on that US produced cerveza as well. So again, we're just waiting to see what consumers do with price increases, and exactly how those are going to play out. It's not going to be pretty either
Here
way.
is here is some recent history for how we can think about what consumers might do. This is specific to spirits now. So again, if you're with us on YouTube, you see a chart that looks at the volume growth by spirits category. This is information from Discus, representing the change from 2022 to 23. Now, the story of pandemic years of say 2020, 21 was certainly this massive rush toward the highest end of price tiers across multiple spirits categories. And what we saw in 23 and certainly in 24 is kind of the leveling off of those highest end. And so when we think about tariffs in particular, this is a great example that I've been sharing when we think about tequila. For
Mm,
Americans, the margarita is the number one cocktail, no questions asked, year over year. The tequila is tequila in this case. Not a
mhm.
lot of people on a whole are just pouring out glasses of tequila. They're not just doing it. I'm going to have my neat tequila at
Sipping
the end of the
tequila.
day.
Yep.
Right? So what we see has happened, and especially this year, is there's just been a natural trade down. So instead of spending $50 on a bottle of tequila, like people did maybe 2 years ago, now maybe they're spending $40. This is a
Mhm.
big discussion between declines of Casamigos, famously known as George Clooney's founded tequila brand, and growth of Don Julio, both in the same portfolio. Don Julio is about $10 to $15 cheaper. And
Mhm.
so that's where growth has come from. And so when we think about the impact of consumer behavior, obviously price sensitivity comes into play. And tequila, especially as it relates to tariffs, is a great
Mm.
place to think about. People wanted tequila And so when tequila is tequila, they're happy to trade down, save some bucks, and still have the same kind of flavor enjoyment they might have. Again, this comes back to what we may see with what could happen within the beer space too, where if you can save a few bucks, still have an approximate experience of that beer like you would a Modelo, things still feel good.
I'd be looking at like Tecate right now, right? Some of those sub Pacifico and Modelo brands, Dos Equis perhaps, just to see, are consumers interested in the Mexicanness of the brand, or would they choose a domestic beer? It'll be an interesting, honestly, it'll be an interesting case study, if nothing else.
One change in the market that is playing out in real time right now, Kate. Stoli filed bankruptcy for a couple of its U.S. subsidiaries the first week of December. And so this, I think, sets off a whole host of alarms. Over the course of the last several months, obviously, there's been lots of discussions in the alcohol space about what's going on with drinking behaviors and how people are choosing things. There are also other things at play behind what caused this decision for Stoli. Let's catch people up really quick, just give some context about what's happened here.
Right. I think if you just caught the headline, Stoli USA declares bankruptcy, you'd think, oh, yep, well, it's not a super premium vodka. Times are tough for that little chunk of the market. There we go. No, there are some extremely specific circumstances related to Stoli as a business and as a brand. First, we should say that this is only its U.S. subsidiary. This does not affect other global pieces of the Stoli company. And the issue, there are a few pieces of background here. Stoli was USA was the target of a cyber attack earlier in the year that really severely crippled its operations. It kind of had to go back to like pen and paper business records for a while. Just massively disruptive to their operations. Two, their founder has been locked in a protracted legal battle with the Russian government for years, if not decades, which relates to how the company was formed. We will not get into this history lesson, but the Russian government truly is trying to hobble this company through protracted and expensive legal battles. So all of this is to say the company had a lot of distractions unrelated to whether or not people are drinking vodka in the US, right? However, it is also not a boom time for sales of the particular type of vodka that Stoli is selling. And I think this is a nice opportunity to just kind of talk about what's going on in vodka and, as a microcosm of that industry.
Yeah, if you are with us on the video version on the screen, you can see a chart that shows control state sales for the month of October, most recent data that we have as we are talking right now. Vodka showed some growth compared to a year ago, plus 2% roughly. However, that's still below the total category growth for these control states. So what's happening with Stoli certainly gives us an avenue to talk about what's happening more broadly within the spirit category. Those top three categories: RTD cocktails, which grew at almost 42% versus a year ago; tequila, almost 13% up; Canadian whiskey, 10.5% up. Those are all well above total category growth rates. And all three of those also represent key spaces for the broader, not just spirits, but beverage category. RTD cocktails, I don't know if we need to rehash a lot. High noon, neutral, all these things, obviously game changer for the last few years. Tequila has been a rocket ship unto its own. The growth rate of Canadian whiskey caught my eye, not out of surprise so much as I don't know if I expected it to perform this well. And it is worth calling out to listeners and viewers. This is something that we have connected with often on sightlines, the power of what flavor can do. And if you're thinking
Mhm.
Canadian whiskey, you are thinking Crown Royal. But the leading just base regular Crown Royal brand has not been performing well for some time. It's down almost 0.5% in the last 3 months of sales as we're talking, while the category in Crown Royal as a whole is up. Crown Royal up 9% almost. The reason for that is because of flavors like royal apple and vanilla and honey and other things that have been driving growth both for Crown Royal and the category as well. And so just, I think when we talk about, especially something like vodka and the sales challenges it may be facing, we also have to think about it in terms of the way that it's just going up against other brands or categories that can more directly offer enjoyment and flavor in ways that it
Mhm.
can't on its own.
Well, vodka was that original spirit for flavors, right? I think you and I, Bryan, came of legal drinking age during the like flavored vodka boom, where if you wanted a toasted marshmallow or cucumber vodka, you could find it. I don't think those are not the hot new thing on the block anymore. Perhaps these flavored whiskeys are more interesting to consumers today. Notably, on a slide that you showed earlier, if people are watching us on YouTube, the sales of super premium vodkas are up. It's just some of these value premium and high end vodkas that are down. So another interesting development here within the last couple of days, Constellation Brands is going to sell Svedka, the brand, to Sazerac as it divests itself of less premium brands in the spirits and wine space. Really interesting because Svedka basically was Constellation spirits category. It comprised about 75% of their total spirit sales. Svedka was the fourth best-selling vodka brand in volume. However, Constellation just doesn't see the sort of mid-range vodka as core to its growth anymore, and it is happy to offload that to Sazerac. So just kind of interesting developments in this run-of-the-mill like standard vodka brand space. The highest end is still growing. Consumers seem meh on the middle parts.
This connects a little bit to the way that we describe tequila too, especially with
Yep.
vodka, where
Yep.
vodka is vodka. In
Yep.
American, drinking culture, this is more often than not becoming mixed. It's part of a cocktail. It's part of a simple mix of something too. So that certainly makes sense. The one area where vodka does have success, Kate, obviously, is within those RTD cocktails. That's a space
Absolutely.
that's been growing fast. And since 2021 has easily been the top selling base for canned cocktails too.
Mhm.
Just when we think about, I guess maybe the future of vodka as
Mhm.
its in its role within the spirit space. Obviously, it's the highest volume selling spirit in the country.
Mhm.
But the
Yeah.
use case, again, the consumer point of view of how it fits into what they want to do is changing a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Vodka is still roughly a third of all spirits volume sold through control state stores. Like it's a massive, obviously, piece of the spirits category. It has always been a flavor delivery vehicle, either mixed with something else or in a flavored format in decades past. Or now today, I think the evolution of that is these pre-mixed cocktails. So again, I think it's hard. American consumers do not parse the distinctions among vodka brands on their own. They are a vehicle for delivering flavor, except unless you are at a bar, you are calling the specific spirit for your vodka martini, in which case you choose that super premium Grey Goose or what have you. So I think this explains what we're seeing. Where vodka is succeeding is those ultra premium brands or as a flavored delivery vehicle in RTD cocktails.
One way to think about this, to put a bookend on that too, in Circana tracked chain retail, vodka as a share of total spirits dropped from 36% share in 2019 to 25% share in 2023. This is not correlation causation, but at the same time, the share of canned cocktails, spirit-based seltzers, shot up from 7% to 30%. So, when you're thinking about vodka and its existence within the consumer point of view, its point as a mixer all of a sudden becomes trumped to some, most certainly, for the simplicity of that canned cocktail. So keeping that consumer use case in mind, what it means for consumers and how they think about these things, certainly makes a big difference. Kate, let's finish by talking about a couple of things that we think make a big difference. We are speaking in December, so this is the end of the year as we're thinking back about what we've covered at Sightlines, what certainly we have coming up as well with Sightlines. For listeners, viewers, we picked out a couple of items that we thought were of interest to us as things that maybe are underreported or undercovered that certainly have caught our eye. One thing that really kind of grabbed me in the last few months, we've talked a lot, both like within the narrative of how people think hard seltzer is dead, dying. People don't care about it, which is certainly not the case at all. A quote on the screen, if you're with us on YouTube, Reese, who is a staff member at a wine store, making a comparison between the ability to buy a $25 bottle of wine versus you could just spend $15 on an 8% ABV pack of White Claw Surge, and that gets the job done effectively if you're thinking about alcohol as a delivery vehicle. Why am I interested in hard seltzer? Because it's still selling around like $3.6, $3.7 billion, depending on what 52-week rolling period you look at. That's the same amount as all spirits-based RTDs, all wine-based RTDs. And I hate to see it when Truly and Boston Beer's earnings call dominate the narrative about what's going on with hard seltzer. Meanwhile, White Claw is actually growing incrementally as the market leader. And it just seems like a space where, as people have passed by, consumers certainly have not. And I think that's really important to think about, again, from the consumer point of view, about how they're looking at this category still core to their alcohol purchasing, but more broadly across the industry, just less and less attention and an assumption that it's had its day and it's over.
Yeah, I think my pick is similar. Something that maybe doesn't get the shine or attention it deserves for being quite a large player. Boxed wine. I am very interested in seeing what happens in the boxed wine category next year. Despite the overall wine category struggles, boxed wine is up in dollar sales in the NIQ, 52-week period ending in October, selling just a little bit below what spirits-based RTDs sell. So those get plenty of headlines and ink. Box wine, nearly there with them. I feel like folks aren't talking about it. I am watching some of these like newer boxed wine brands with better aesthetics and like interesting sustainability messaging. These are brands like Ami Ami, Grazie, Nomatica, which is selling like orange wine in 3-liter boxes. Super interesting, super different from box wine brands of yore. And I just think there's some, as consumers are sort of like more value minded, but still want stuff that looks cool, I think box wine and some of these newer brands are really ones to watch.
These are all things that we cover at sightlines.news, keeping you ahead of what's going on and keeping in the know of what you should be listening, reading, and looking for. That's going to be it for this episode of The Gist. If you want more in-depth analysis and actionable insights, join us at sightlines.news, where subscribers get weekly updates delivered to their inbox. Until next time, I'm Brian Roth with Kate Bernat.